And if we did a decent job, of course, this should just reflect over and be good. It's close. And again, I don't trust the possible distortions in a paper pattern to absolutely use this, but I think we can use this pattern to get the straight edge of the plywood and the small curve that starts there and the bevel. And again, the nice thing about this design approach is you don't have to cut this in advance. You can let it stay long, and once the plywood's all glued on there, come along and use the stringer as a guide up until it gets super steep, and we'll talk about that later. But yeah, I'm pretty happy with that. Let's do the same for the side. Hate to waste another 16-foot run of this paper. It looks like I can barely get a close enough pattern, and so I think that's what we'll do. We'll just use this cutoff. Again, this is a rough sizing. We'll be able to cut large. Just need to know how to use the plywood pieces. That's enough for being able to lay out our pieces of plywood, cut them into side strips and bottom strips, and do the scarf joint. Well, we're back from our trip to Kelly's Island, Lake Erie, and need to at least temporarily find a new home for my old boat Cosmo here. Gonna need the other half of the garage initially to refinish this guy for our friend Sue before we give it back to her, and if the sailing rowboat gets done successfully, it'll live there, at least for the time being, next to a little sailing kayak. And my dad's agreed graciously to let us store Cosmo up at his place, and not too far away. So, another step on the sailing rowboat, finding, at least temporarily, new space for this guy. Alright, back from our little vacation, and one step I wanted to pick up on is adding a fiberglass epoxy layer around this joint on the daggerboard trunk. I've kind of done a little bit of a radius to try to get this fiberglass cloth to cover that radius. And I'm trying again to see if I can get the drips minimized down in the inside of that daggerboard trunk by laying in some masking tape, and we'll see how that goes. But here is where we're at. This is another milestone, first fiberglassing. This is actually finer stuff, 4 ounce.
I have a fire out here, and
oh, yeah.
the kitty's outside.
It's got another kind of love-hate thing. Same with epoxy. It's awesome stuff, but it gets to be really a mess pretty easily. So I've got 2 pieces for the longitudinals. These guys will go down into the ends, wrap around we'll go ahead and mix up just a little bit of epoxy and see how this goes. And then maybe go out for a little bonfire. Alright, got somebody to run the camera, which is awesome. 2 pieces in, I put epoxy down first, laid these in, and you can see it's kind of disappearing, but the idea is you want to get enough to bed the cloth in epoxy, but not too much to make it float. It won't bond. Add that in with epoxy. So one of the main things is really sharp scissors that you gotta keep cleaning. After you're done, trunk area is the most leak prone. And with these boats, a leak, the worst kind, is just a little pinhole seep. Because you don't see it right away. The wood swells, then dries out. Next time it gets wet, it's a bigger hole. And in the daggerboard trunk, you can't see it if it's starting to get wet, and it's going to rot. And by the time you do see it, it's going to be a potentially major repair. And I'm kind of going until that weave disappears from view. And it generates heat chemically, and that drives the curing process. So if the ambient temperature isn't warm enough, 60 is borderline. It'll go slower if it's cooler.
How long does it take to cure?
On average, it'll be tacky, so 3 hours in, at which point you can put another coat, and it'll chemically bond. Ooh, this is where it starts to get ugly. It'll chemically bond to the other coat. About 10 hours in, you can sand it, and it'll continue to cure through a full 24-hour time. So it's better to sand it before it's fully cured because it becomes rock hard. Got a small window potentially to make the epoxy set if we manage to get some scarf joints cut and glued. So pushed the boat outside, cleaned up the floor a little bit, and we'll try to lay these 4 sheets out, good side up, and see if we can get a best arrangement, mark them on rough with the patterns that we made, and at least cut them into 4 pieces, or actually 8. 4 bottoms, 4 sides, maybe try to do a scarf joint. Well, Deb's got an idea here. I've flipped these things around bunches of different ways and trying to get a continuous pattern across the joint and minimize the darker wood where possible is kind of the goal. And no combination does a really great joint is more than 2 feet. Right on 2 feet. Whew. Hard to say what the answer is. Go back to Home Depot and look for 2 better sheets of plywood.
The other thought, Doug, is you want the pretty piece for the side. I mean, you do have this here. From here on down isn't too bad, so maybe you could do a side here.
And a bottom.
And a side here, and then the bottom over here. Yeah, that works.
I think that's probably the best bet.
Good.
Awesome.
There you go.
Problem solved.
Problem solved.
Ask the wife. One other piece of the puzzle we need to think about is where, especially for the bottom, since that joint is visible and probably needs a little backing board over it. I had to do that last time, I think. Just to preserve the scarf joint as the piece is being maneuvered around to get on the boat. It's very weak. Where does that show inside the boat? And so if you come from the bow, you're running a little bit less than 8 feet from the bow. And that scarf joint is going to be showing right in the middle of this open area of the boat. That's F3, it'll be gone. And, you know, that's okay. But I think it'd be better if we can get the joint to fall underneath this seat, the thwart, for rowing where the daggerboard goes through. And I think if we use the max of the plywood from the stern, we can get that scarf joint to fall there. So I think that's a plan. 1, 2, 3, 4. I guess I'm recording. So I'm happy with the ability to match up one side. I'm drawing it very wide, but can't find a good solution here, so I'm trying to shuffle around. Alright, I think this is a solution. I'll actually completely rearrange these sheets. I think we can miss this little guy. And got to take account, maybe miss this little guy. I'd really like to miss those. Have a nice clear piece up on the bow. This will be very visible, and in general the side will be very visible all across the boat. But I think that's about as good as I can get out of these sheets. Well, with a little luck, we have workable, scarf jointable bottom pieces and side pieces. We'll see. Alright, we've got our start of an alternative scarf jig. I made the angle slightly steeper, and we need backing blocks on this 9.5 degree angle. The other one was 7. And that'll reduce the length I lose and still provide, I think, enough strength for these joints. guide that the saw fence will sit on, and I'll make it for my new saw. It looks like with a little bit of finagling, this will be capable of doing cuts in a good enough zone. I had to put a little shim here with a clamp just on the other side of it to try to ensure the very lip of this little guy is as far down as we can. Give it a try. I hope it works. Well, it's close. There's a little gap in here. Again, if this were solid wood, you could let the sharp end ride up a little bit and plane it down flat. But this veneer is so thin, you don't have much to work with. So I think that's going to be all right. We have our 4 scarf cuts made on the bottom pieces, and in spite of the low temps predicted for the evening, I figured with a heater right under this joint we could keep the epoxy curing. So went ahead and glued the first of the 2 bottom pieces together. One of the tricks is to make sure you cover as much of the gap by positioning the pieces as close as you can without letting one ride too high, and you can't sand off that veneer. So we put a nice piece of leftover select pine across there and clamped it down, and I think that was pretty good to get the first of the 2 bottom pieces glued together. Next morning, checked our glue joint on the first bottom side, and had to keep this heater going, and I put a little thermometer on top of it, and it was in the zone. The brush was rock hard, so I think we're good. But rather than take this piece off and torque on that joint, I just left it there, and now I've glued the other bottom piece right on top of it with obviously wax paper in between. So we'll let that set up for a while too. And then one little item it's easy to forget that I didn't do in the first boat I built is to cut little channels in each of these to let water flow past the keelson over each of these ribs. You want to be able to bail the boat in one place, in the lowest place it's sitting at the moment. So you want all the water, no matter where it's sitting, to flow past the ribs. And so found out later there's a fancy name for these things. I don't know what it is, but I'm going to go ahead and cut those out. So here at R1 is a little different because the wall is gone. So the water lowest point would be sitting right on top of the keelson, but that's all right. I'm going to seal all this. It should be able to flow out those channels. We'll do the same back. Well, it's really chilly out. Actually, snow, sleety things last night, but kept the heater going underneath this joint after gluing up the second half of the bottoms right on top of the first. And it's had just about 24 hours. So I think it's all right. The brush, which I didn't have near the heater, seems to have cured pretty well. And I also made some putty out of the leftover in the jar, and that seems to have gone off. So I think we're all right. What I'd like to do next is put a backing block behind this joint, just a strip of 1/4-inch birch. Primarily so that as these sheets are being maneuvered around the shop, if the veneer snaps, then there's not much strength left inside this stuff. So doing that is going to be a little tricky unless the temp comes back up, but we'll see. So it's not bad. I'm sure with a really high-end purpose-built scarfing jig you could get a better edge, but even though there's a gap there, I really want these two surfaces to be flat, and we can fill this gap. I think laying a strip of masking tape down both sides of this and just laying some more epoxy in there, that'll make it sand smooth pretty good. And the one underneath here, same way. So, still moving forward in spite of the cold weather.